valleys and stuff. But if you did that soiling technique we're talking about, you could plant a lot of mesquite, because mesquite has roots that can go down 150 feet to get to water. It's a very good arid country plant. So here we are getting a yield better than corn without any inputs. No irrigation, no fertilizer. All we have to do is pick the damn pots. Okay? Now, gosh, there's so much I want to talk about, and we're just going to run over, but I'll just try to zero in on your questions. Something I'd love to talk about but don't have time is solar saturation. Basically, you saw that corn does what it can, but it reaches a point at which more sunlight does not make more corn and actually stresses it and wastes the sunlight. So many of your crops can be grown under light shade. So, for instance, Mexican corn growing is a corn plant, beans that climb up the corn plant, and squash that's grown under the corn plant field. So what happens is the beans use about 30% of the sunlight and shade the corn. The corn uses about 30% of the sunlight, and they both shade the squash, which uses about 30% of the sunlight. So now you're using 90% of the available sunlight when the average American cornfield only uses 30%, because for reasons I don't have time to get into, plants photosaturate. In the middle of the day, they stop making food, unless they have shade. So here we've got these mesquite trees in the desert, making a nice cool microclimate underneath, a nice light shade, So now we can grow crops under here like buffalo gourd underneath, or pimillons. These are similar to gourds. And both of these yield about 400 gallons per acre also, but they can grow underneath the mesquite. So now you're getting 800 gallons per acre, and you haven't used any water yet. Okay? But the other thing about buffalo gourds and pimillons is, the seeds are really oily. So if you press the seeds and make the rest of the pimillon into alcohol, there's enough oil in the seeds for 150% of the energy you need to process the alcohol. You can just use the oil and fuel oil burners. Or you can make biodiesel. So I'm just giving you an idea of how we could start to think about energy crops beyond the simple growing of monoculture crops. Okay, I'm going to talk about kelp. You got kelp off the coast here. So do I off California. Kelp is a plant. But what's great about kelp is it doesn't have to stand up. So normal plants have cellulose, which is fibrous, and just like fiberglass is strong because of a combination of fibers and resin, plants have a resin as well called lignin, which saturates the fiber. The lignin is very brittle, just like fiberglass would, like fiberglass resin would be, and the fibers, of course, are floppy but very, very, very good shear strength, etc. When you mix them together, you got redwood trees. You've got a combination of lignin and cellulose. But water plants don't have to do that. So they don't have to put their energy into making lignin, and they make something called laminarin, which has been used. I found research on this back in the 1920s, where people were making alcohol out of kelp, and all they did is basically heat it up with some acid, dissolve the laminarin into sugar, and fermented it, and they were getting at least 55 gallons per ton. That's pretty good. So let's talk about how in permaculture we can use this. How many people have heard of the dead zone? Okay, about half of you haven't. The dead zone is a place off of New Orleans where the Mississippi empties into the Gulf with all the fertilizer from all the farms in the Midwest and all the sewage and all the lawns draining into the Mississippi. And that nitrogen goes out and algae just booms, explodes, microscopic algae. And it grows great for a little while, but it has a life cycle and it dies. And when it dies, it uses oxygen to decompose. And it uses all the oxygen in the water for 22,000 square miles. So anything that breathes oxygen, any sea life that breathes oxygen, if it can't swim away from this airless zone, dies. And that's not even the biggest dead zone in the world. There's 167,000 square mile dead zone in one of the big lakes in the the Soviet Union, and there's basically 150 of these dead zones around the world. So the point is we've got nutrient soup. And in permaculture, we always look at that as a surplus. It's not a waste product. It's a surplus that we need to design with. So in China, they always, at the mouths of rivers along the coast, is they grow kelp on nets out here on the surface. And they have a big kelp farm. And they can harvest the kelp. They just keep cutting it. Grows a foot a day. Gets long, they cut it. It grows another foot a day. And it takes those nutrients out of the water. And it makes lots of carbohydrates that you can make into alcohol. So you go, well, this is one of those, crazy dreamer ideas that would never go anywhere, right? Well, American Gas Association. These are the guys who deliver natural gas, right? So they studied off the California coast alone what we could do with kelp to produce energy. They came up with a figure of 24 quads of energy. This is 2 shitloads of energy. This is a lot of energy. Okay, the amount of gasoline that we use in the United States adds up to about 16 quads. So in theory, just growing algae off the coast of California, we can replace all the gasoline. Using kelp. Now, let's do it off of New Orleans. In permaculture, we always try to do things for multiple reasons, called stacking functions. So we go ahead and get the kelp farms going off of New Orleans. And, of course, how do carbohydrates get made? There's carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight. If sunlight's hitting the water, what is it doing? It's heating it up. But if it hits kelp, it stays cool. So basically, the sunlight is turning into carbohydrates, and it's not heating the water. In fact, water may be 20 degrees over what it would be during hurricane season. And when a hurricane is heading for New Orleans next time and it hits that cold water, it stumbles. Drops down a couple of categories at least before it hits land. So here we can grow kelp out there and hurricane-proof the coast and get rid of the dead zone and make oxygen oases for all the creatures that live in the Gulf, because the kelp is constantly taking in carbon dioxide and breathing out oxygenated water.
But you have to keep harvesting that for it to work, right?
No, it'll just keep growing if you don't harvest it. It just gets 150 feet longer.
Why don't you get a dead zone there? Because of the extra nutrients.
The kelp is absorbing the nutrients.
Okay,
and it's producing oxygen. So it's doing multiple functions. And we can produce, again, most of what we need just from kelp. We haven't gotten the land yet. Okay.
Does that modify the storm surges on stuff too, having all those kelp beds on?
Not too much. It won't do much about storm surge. Yeah. But it will definitely cool the water and turn that energy that was otherwise a problem. I mean, warming the oceans is a bad idea. I could do a whole other thing on that. But basically, what do I want to do? Get some of this covered so I don't keep you guys too late.
Who's been fighting? You have this idea. Why hasn't it happened? I mean, who's been fighting?
Oh, it is happening.
Kelp?
The kelp idea? Well, up until recently, gasoline has been so cheap, natural gas has been so cheap that nobody's been inspired to do anything like this. And of course, it would take somebody with a lot of capital to do this, But they do it in China. They have giant kelp farms in China, So it's totally understood present-day technology that doesn't need any further development and could be deployed immediately. Now, I'm going to have to jump into the byproducts. And I'll tell you a little bit about the book, and then I'll continue for those who have time to stay. One of the food versus fuel issues is, of course, we can't grow all this corn for our cars because we'd starve people in Africa. So out of the corn we grow, about 70% of it goes to cattle and other animals in the United States. Another 17% of it is exported, actually it's a little more than 17%, is exported to Africa? Mexico? No, Europe, to feed rich people's cattle. So 87% of the corn is animal.